This is our fourth and final class of our four-class block on rediscovering the Old Testament. We have gone through Torah, the Law, Nevi'im, the Prophets, and tonight we will be on Ketuvim, which roughly translated means something like writings, scripture, stuff and things. That's my translation at the bottom, stuff and things. It's a little bit of a grab bag here. It's kind of like the things that don't necessarily fit everywhere else. Again, in the Greek ordering of the Septuagint, we would have a couple of differences here. We would have this as kind of the wisdom section, where we'll have Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job, Song of Songs. But we would have things like, say, Daniel in Major Prophets. Well, Daniel actually appears here. Ezra and Nehemiah we would have as books of history, as we would probably have Ruth and Esther. Yet all of these, even though they might seem like a bit of a hodgepodge, are connected together in the Hebrew ordering in Ketuvim, which are the writings or the scriptures. Some of the groupings have to do with the common themes, Psalms, Proverbs, and Job, for example, sometimes being called the poetic books or the wisdom books. And some of them have to do with the size of the books and how they tended to be grouped in order for purposes of things as simple as storage. Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther all fit on one scroll apiece and tended to be put in the same spot. They were referred to then as the five scrolls, which is why a somewhat disparate group of books wind up being kind of collected together. They're short, they're simple, they're relatively to the point, and they wind up getting categorized in the same spot. And so that's why those wind up going together. I'm going to spend extremely little time on Chronicles. Any thoughts on why? Chronicles is basically a retelling of the Book of Kings. First and Second Chronicles roughly retell First and Second Kings. A little bit is different here and there. The main difference between Kings and Chronicles is when they're written. They are telling stories of roughly the same things, but one is happening relatively at the time of the events, First and Second Kings. The other is happening after the Babylonian captivity, First and Second Chronicles. It is a retelling of the past in Israel's glory days. Now that they are the lowest of the low, they have lost everything that they had, they need to be reminded of where they come from. They need to be reminded of who they are based off of who they have been. What the Lord has done for them. Though they have nothing now, they need to be reminded why they lost all that they had. A, so they might regain the Lord's favor and get back this stuff. And B, that they would finally learn their lesson and not get themselves into trouble that had them move into captivity in the first place. So pretty much everything that we said in 1st and 2nd Kings, just kind of ditto for 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It is not verbatim, it is not exact, but that's the gist of it. Imagine, if you will, histories about the Civil War written sometime roughly around the end of the 19th century. They were using eyewitness accounts, they were using source material. These were people who were talking about places and events of recent living memory, and now think about a book that was written last year about the Civil War. And there may be purposes to that are kind of helpful in having a book written well after the fact. There are certain things that happen in the past that take on a greater degree of prominence now that we have seen the flow of history. Certain events, for example, in the Civil War, might have seemed very trivial at the time. But now, decades and decades after the fact, we see things that might have seemed small were actually quite significant. please think of Chronicles in the same manner. This is writing history well after the fact, and it's doing so for a purpose, to remind Israel who they really are. You have not always been captives. Remember your history. You have not always been captives. Remember what you did that led to this place, so you never do it again. So, one of the things that tends to connect these books sort of in a variety of ways and to varying degrees is the aspect of poetry. That these books, by and large, may be understood as being poetic or have large parts of them that are expressed through poetry. Now, if you have kind of a knee-jerk response to that and think, that we're subdividing here, there's historical accounts and there's poetic accounts, and one is kind of like true and one is sort of made up. It's not really like that at all. If you can remember back to some sort of freshman English class or something in high school where the poor maligned teacher was trying to beat into indifferent students a love of poetry, or at least something that moves beyond despising poetry. And what they would have described has something to do with poetry actually allows us to convey truth in some of the clearest manners possible. Okay, what is the shortest distance between 2 points? Except when it's on the globe. On a sphere, a straight line is not the shortest distance. It's a curve. A curved line on the globe, within context, is actually the shortest distance between two cities, say for a flight. And poetry needs to be understood in a sort of a similar manner. That it can be the shortest distance between 2 points of trying to describe truth or emotion or fact or passion. It just so happens that because of the context, that poetry is the quickest, easiest, and shortest way to do so. Think of it, again, in these practical terms. You say to your husband or your wife or your children or your friends, I love you. Okay? Statement of fact. If the response is, how? How do you love me? A, you're in trouble for all sorts of reasons. But B, they're not actually looking for, well, I love you because of A, and B, and C, and subparagraph D, -1. I mean, there's a way to convey the truth of your feelings, of your emotion, the certainty of your commitment or your fidelity or your passions, that kind of the mechanical recitation of items doesn't quite capture. And that's why from time immemorial, the bards, the greeting card industry have written things in poetic forms. My love is like a red, red rose. I mean, there's just something about that there's a depth of meaning there that's better than, I love you because you're nice. I mean, okay, and so, once again, the concept of poetry here, Hebrew poetry is a little different than English poetry. A, does not rhyme. Don't look for rhyming. But it's more of the focus and the purpose to the writing. That there's something both underneath the text and there's something inside of the text. How the words are structured themselves conveys meaning. The cadence of the words, the way that they're grouped together, the way that they repeat or they parallel each other are intended to communicate things. So much, for example, the book of Psalms is lost on us because Hebrew is not our native tongue. And we're not typically reading this in Hebrew. Psalm 119 that we actually read from for evening prayer just before this class is the longest psalm in the Bible. It's also the longest chapter of any book in the Bible. what people don't tend to realize is that Psalm 119 is broken into 8 verse stanzas. And the first word, the first letter of each of those stanzas makes an acrostic for the Hebrew alphabet. In English, if we saw a poem that had 26 lines and that said, A is for alligator, B is for bear, C is, we would sort of know, oh, there's a pattern here. And it's something different than just sort of putting some thoughts together, but there was actually a lot of work put into creating it in a very specific and particular way. And Hebrew poetry is like that. There are little things both in the Psalms, and even we can find them in other pieces of the Bible, where the structure itself of parallelism is done in a very specific way. The chiastic structure, where a line will be parallel here, and you'll actually see the writing. If you could put it out line by line, it would almost look like this. And then it might repeat itself in a mirrored fashion. These are kind of little tricks and tips that we don't tend to see in the English, because there is a richness of depth in the poetry that's really, really difficult to convey from one language to another. If you remember our talk on idioms several weeks ago, I mean, idioms just don't really make any sense literally translated from one language to another. Pulling my leg, you put that in Russian, and it just makes no sense. Because we're not literally grabbing somebody's extremity and jerking on it. And so some of the poetry is going to be lost on us. But some of it, however, is not. And that's why I gave you this copy of Psalm 1. If you will look on the section where it's all in one paragraph, in a very bland, boring Arial font, you will see that Psalm 1 through 6, conveys factual information. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. So far, so good. It's all true stuff. If you don't follow stupid, mean, wicked, evil people, it's going to go good for you. If you are someone who avoids that, and you love reading the Bible, and you think about it and pray about it all the time, you will be blessed. Right? Right. He's like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields fruit in its season, whose leaf does not wither. Okay? Whatever he does prospers, not so the wicked. They're like the chaff the wind blows away. On and on and on, 1 through 6. Flip it over to the back. Even in English, they try to capture with its formatting something that conveys the impression of poetry. And I put it in a nicer, prettier, more poetic font, and hopefully that sort of underscores the point. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers. Already verse 1 stands alone, and it starts to develop a rhythm, and it starts to develop a cadence. Blessed is the man, and that's where we start, who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers. I mean, there's the factual information there, and it's kind of a linear progression, but suddenly, when you kind of set it apart, when you indent here and there, then you see the parallelism start to come up to the front. Blessed is the man, the three things he does not do. 1, and like 2, and like 3. But, breaking up a refrain, his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He's like a tree planted by streams of water. Why? Because he is woody with bark and grows leaves? No. A tree planted in the desert versus a tree planted by a stream of water, which one is stronger? Healthier, more vibrant, grows larger, which yields fruit in season, whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. Using a metaphor, an illustration here. This is, I guess, technically a simile. Again, poetic license to further underscore how this man is blessed. Like a tree planted by streams of water, and here goes the parallelism, which yields its fruit in season, whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. And when you see them laid out, and you see them indented, when you read them like a poem, even though they do not rhyme, a cadence and a rhythm starts to develop. And you start to see how these things are intended to interconnect beyond the factual. Let us continue. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff, the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Again, we could just say that it's sort of helpful or accurate information, but now start looking at the parallelism. Don't take it as a paragraph. Take it as a 6-stanza poem, where suddenly it now has two halves. The first half and the second half. If the first half is about the man who was blessed, what's the second half about? Wicked. Somebody who's not blessed, he's wicked. And what's going to happen to the wicked? He's not going to be like a tree planted by a stream of water. What is he going to be like? Chaff. It's almost the poetic opposite of a tree. A tree planted by water is going to be strong. It's going to be rooted deeply. It's going to be verdant and green and full of fruit. Chaff is the dried up dead stuff that happens when plants have nothing useful left. Like what's around the part of the wheat that you would like, or the sticks and the leaves once everything is dried up and fallen off the ground. And so already the parallelism is intended to communicate not just the truth, that it's better to read the Bible and not hang out with the bad crowd, versus somebody who won't listen to people and take good advice. I mean, he could have just said that and be done with it, but develop this poetic way of explaining that deeper truth by the shortest means possible. It just so happens it is a curve. The shortest way to describe what it's like to love the Scriptures and to pray about them and think about them and to ruminate on them is poetry. You can say it makes you smart, makes you do good things, makes you think about the right. Or you can say, man, it helps you root. And so, what's good about being rooted? Like a tree that has roots that go deep versus a tree that has roots that are shallow, which one is more likely to survive a storm? Which one is more likely to survive a drought? Which one is more likely to survive a cold snap? Someone whose roots go deep because they're constantly reading the Bible, they're constantly thinking about it, praying about it, considering it, studying it. When life is dry and hard, who is going to have something solid underneath them? The person who studies or the person who does not? When life is cold and unforgiving, who is going to be able to weather that storm and survive until things warm back up? When things are hot or hard or scary? Who has been nourished from deep within and not just at the surfacey level? The poetry in this case, it's not just taking the circuitous route. This isn't the scenic route. It's the shortest distance between 2 points. It just so happens that in real life, it's like the globe. It happens to be a curve. Now, once we have gotten the concept of poetry behind us, I'd like to spend a little bit of time on these individual books. Esther and Ruth are interesting books. They're both very brief. Just a handful of chapters. They are notable for a couple of reasons that might strike you off the top of your head. Ruth and Esther, for example, are named after women. Okay, how many other books in the Bible are named after women? Okay, so Ruth and Esther. Ruth and Esther have as the most prominent character women. And both of them testify to a faithfulness and a courage of the women from whom those books are named. Ruth, if you recall the story, Ruth is the daughter-in-law of Naomi. Naomi is a Jew. Ruth is a pagan. She's from Moab, and Naomi has had some sons, 2 sons, and they are both married to women from Moab. And then this is like the Charlie Brown calamity family, because the husband, Elimelech, dies, and then Ruth's husband dies, and then the other son, he dies, and suddenly what was a happy, fairly stable, pretty decent sized little family is just completely leveled. And all of the men croak. And so we are left with a family of 3 widows. And that is big bad news. For all sorts of reasons, for some cultural reasons about property, about finances and that sort of thing. But I mean, let's just be honest here. What would you do if you lost half of your family like that? I mean, emotionally and spiritually, how do you cope with that? And then when you think about, well, how are we going to survive and how are we going to live and what are we going to do with stuff? And so Naomi makes what she believes to be the gracious response to free these daughter-in-laws, to say, I love you girls, we have shared in this tragedy, but go home to Moab. Go to your people. Go to where folks know you. If you've got some long-distance relations, maybe they'll take you in. But, I mean, my life is over. I'm going to slink back home and try to find family, but basically I got nothing, but don't follow me. And the women, they like, oh, boo, 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 we love you. And one of them says, you're right, I love you, but I got to go. And she leaves. And Ruth says, no. Whither thou goest, I shall go. We often hear this read in weddings. And it is this incredibly beautiful, poetic, incredibly beautiful statement of fidelity. Where you go, I will go. Your God will be my God. And this will be my home, my family, and my life, no matter what. I don't see a way out of this either. But that's not what this is about. I stand with you, no matter what. And so, Ruth and Naomi, they travel back to Israel, and they are able to be cared for by what turns out to be a distant relation. This distant relation, who is a man of some means, Boaz, who winds up taking a shine to Ruth, not just because she's real pretty, apparently, at least that's the impression we get, but because Ruth is A, faithful to Naomi, and B, is modest. That he sort of figures out what's going on when he's got these 2 widows who are kind of around the periphery, sort of dumpster diving on his property. There's a part of the Jewish law where the gleanings are left behind. That if your property, for example, is a square, you may harvest the circle, but the corners you leave. And anything that happens to drop as you are harvesting your wheat or your corn or whatever, if it drops, you leave it. Because that's what the poor will be able to survive on. And so he notices these 2 new women are out there, and they're picking up all this stuff that's left behind. And he finds out, well, what's their story? And he's so taken by the faithfulness of Ruth. And then he's taken by her modesty because she's apparently a bit of a looker. And a woman in that situation, you might expect to use her looks at her advantage to think that, oldest profession and all that kind of stuff. If I need to make a living, well, I got an idea. And she doesn't do that. She doesn't go dig. She doesn't go after the youngest or the hottest or the richest guy. Now, once Naomi finds out that Boaz is interested, Naomi's kind of encouraging things along. But even still, there's this enormous propriety between this relationship. Even when Ruth is basically saying, you know what, if you want me, you can have me. And Boaz says, whoa, wait a second. I'm not that kind of guy, and I will not let you be that kind of girl. You have worked too hard and you have been too faithful. I will care for you. We'll do this the right way. But what Boaz eventually does is take on a somewhat obscure part of Jewish inheritance law and becomes the kinsman redeemer. By being a part of the family, a distant relation, he is actually able to redeem this widow and save her from her widowhood by taking her and all of her family in as his wife. They actually find another relation who'd be a little bit closer, but once he finds out that there's like a Naomi in the bargain and that Ruth didn't have much to her name, you can have her. And it's the faithfulness of Boaz as well, who says, I will do this. I will love this woman. I will bring her mother-in-law into my family as well. And it's almost a parallel of the promise of fidelity that Ruth gives to Naomi. Boaz then gives to Ruth. Now, it's a very small story. Like I said, it's very brief. And frankly, it's just this tiny handful of obscure people. Who really cares, right? I mean, it's sort of neat that in tragedy that, they kind of stick together. And it's sort of inspiring that by doing the right thing, that they're sort of rewarded here, that Boaz kind of saves the day. But when we start thinking about some of the other books that it's around and about all the big dramatic things, and if we're talking about the Exodus, or we're talking about the walls of Jericho tumbling down, or all this kind of stuff. I mean, these are sort of big ticket items, and then what in the world is this tiny little Ruth doing here? And yet, the faithfulness of God, not just in the big dramatic things, but sometimes in the very, very small, the intimate and the personal. We are not cared for solely as a collective, but he knows us each by name. Even a couple of widows out fending for themselves. Oh yeah. And Boaz and Ruth, they eventually have a son. And his son's name is Obed. And Obed has a son.
Jesse.
His name is Jesse. Jesse has a bunch of sons. And the littlest one of all,
David.
he's King David. Even the small stories. And they all count.
So what happened to Esther?
Esther is again the faithfulness and courage of this woman Esther. An interesting book because it never mentions God. Never once mentions God. However, the faithfulness that God has to Israel and Israel ought to extend back to God is evident in everything that happens. This is in part of the captivity, and Esther is Jewish, and the king is intending to take a wife, and he takes Esther, this beautiful woman, without realizing that she is a Jew. This is where the Jewish holiday of Purim comes from. The retelling of this story. Haman, the nasty guy within the king's court, wants to get rid of all the Jews. He wants to take all the property. He doesn't think it's right that these guys who basically should be slaves have some influence and have some stuff. It would be much easier for him if he had all their stuff. And so he cooks up this plot to have all of the Jews eliminated. And it is Mordecai, who is Esther's older cousin, basically an uncle, who has both prepared her, he's raised her, he's prepared her to go to the courts of the king, and is the one who warns her about Haman's plot and what's about to happen. And initially, Esther's saying, what in the world am I supposed to do? I mean, queen sounds like it's a big deal, but let me tell you, this guy has lots of wives. And would you like to know what happened to the last one? I'm not the first one. She displeased him in a very minor way, and it didn't end well for her. I'm not even supposed to speak to him unless he takes his royal scepter and points me out and brings me forward. How in the world am I supposed to come to this guy and start pleading a case, A, for people he doesn't know I'm related to, and that might not go well for me, and B, even if none of that matters, this is breaking all sorts of rules that got the last queen in trouble. And Mordecai basically tells her, you know, there may be a reason that you are in this position of life. There may just be a purpose for you, of all people, being queen at this time. God will save his people. It will happen. It can happen through you, or it can happen in spite of you. But I want you to think long and hard about why you have been given the opportunity to be the queen at this time. And Esther, courage and faithfulness, approaches the king, having no idea if this is going to be her last day on earth or not. Pleads her case, in the case of her people, identifying herself as one of the Jews who will be on the chopping block. And the plot that Haman hatches against the Jews is turned all the way around, and eventually Haman himself is executed on the gallows that he had constructed for Mordecai. It is the faithfulness and it is the courage of Esther, the prompting and the warning of Mordecai. A simple story, and yet so powerful in what it communicates, not just in that time period, but in all time periods, because we all find ourselves in situations where we say, why me? Why now? I didn't sign up for any of this. And yet, perhaps there is a purpose to you being in the role and in the position that you are at this time and at this place. The Lord will save his people. But as C.S. Lewis puts it, there are those who will say, thy will be done, and those who say, mine will be done. The former will be known as his children. The latter will be known as his tools. It can happen with you, or it can happen despite you. Remember now the courage of Esther. The Lamentations are the Lamentations of the prophet Jeremiah, who is called to basically stay in Jerusalem as the city is sacked, conquered, and destroyed, and to mourn, to weep, and to bear witness to the people. The book of Jeremiah is a lengthy book of prophecy, and we talked about that last time. And Lamentations is almost that kind of very personal expression of the pain and the regret of this man who the Lord says, no, you can't leave. You have to stay. You have to watch. You have to bear witness. Imagine not just some terrible event happening in your life, but being forced to sit there and watch it happen, to relive it in your memory and in your dreams. And Lamentations are where we find this played out from Jeremiah and for all of us to remember. Ezra and Nehemiah, considered typically, again in the Greek rendering, books of history. And yet they're sort of disconnected from the first sets of the books of history. If we think about, it's certainly not Torah, but even in the Greek rendering, if we're thinking about things like Joshua or 1st and 2nd Samuel or 1st or 2nd Kings, there's this big gap of time and a big gap of context that happens before Ezra and Nehemiah. And that would basically be, the destruction of the north and south kingdom. Ezra and Nehemiah occur after the Babylonian captivity. Israel, the north, has fallen and been destroyed and scattered. Judah, which holds on just a little longer, is basically taken away. It's conquered by Babylon and they're taken away into captivity. They're sort of traded around. The Babylonians, they get their butts kicked, and everyone gets kind of traded around for a while, and they wind up in the hands of the Assyrians. And Ezra is a priest, is a Jewish priest, and he happens to be, Ezra and Nehemiah both happen to be kind of higher ups within the government of captivity. They are wise, they are bright, they are learned, and Nehemiah impresses it upon the emperor to allow his people, to allow the Jews to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple so that they may worship. And through the grace of God, this is allowed to happen. They're even given stuff in order to make it happen. And this captivity, which is now lasted 2 generations, is allowed to finally return. And Ezra and Nehemiah is the story of the return. Nehemiah is a little more of the nuts and the bolts. Nehemiah is a little bit more of the politician, whereas Ezra is the priest, and he's a little bit more of the life coach, and trying to inspire them, and trying to rally them, trying to remind them of who they are and why they're doing what they're doing. Nehemiah is kind of rah, we can do it. And Ezra is sort of reminding them why we need to do it, So the two books, which in the Hebrew rendering are kind of mashed together, and the Septuagint are separated out, retell the story of how Israel is let out of bondage and returns back and rebuilds Jerusalem, and eventually is able to rebuild the temple itself. It takes both Ezra and Nehemiah to lead the people both from that captivity and to do what they're supposed to do once they get there. Now, you've been held from your home for 2 generations. You're just now returning. You have been allowed to return to rebuild the temple, but you're finally coming back to the homes of your grandfathers and your ancestors in the land of promise and everything that the Bible had always talked about. What should you do when you get there? Oops. They start just sort of building their houses again. Not only is the temple neglected, but any kind of defense and wall is completely forgotten about. And it's up to Ezra and Nehemiah to remind them constantly of these 2 things. A, we were given this chance to rebuild the temple. This is the Lord who has brought us free, and his house needs to be reconstructed before your house is reconstructed. As nice as it might be, his is more important. And why in the world are you so lackadaisical? Don't you remember what happened last time? You got your butts kicked. Granted, if the Lord wants to fight for you, everything will be fine. But remember how you got this mess in the first place. You have been complacent. You have not cared. You have been disinterested. Rebuild the wall. Protect this place. And stop being so self-centered and selfish. Rather than take care of your own little plot of land, think about the community as a whole. Think about what the Lord has done for you. Rebuild his temple. Rebuild this wall. Remember why we went into captivity in the first place. Remember how it is we might be able to stay out. It is Ezra the priest who is typically given the attribution to the writing of Chronicles. And if I had said before that Chronicles was a retelling of the times of the kings for a reason. Like, remember who you are? Well, again, there's the role of Ezra the priest to say, this is who we are. When we start having these celebrations within the temple that Moses commanded, you guys haven't done this forever. There hasn't been a temple for a couple of generations, so you don't remember any of this stuff. I need to teach you. I need to remind you. We're going to have catechism class prior to us having these services because this is holy, holy, holy stuff. And this takes really the book, 1st and 2nd Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah to both motivate and to remind Israel what it is they're getting back into. I find Daniel to be somewhat an odd addition to these writings, mainly because I think Daniel works so nicely within the major prophets. Daniel is very long and has all of the markings of one of the other major prophets. However, some of the context of Daniel, I think, sort of places it where it is within the Hebrew rendering. Remember that Daniel himself is a prophet in captivity. That the best and the brightest of Israel has been carted off and carried away. And there they find themselves in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. And they have these young men from Israel have shown themselves to be smarter and wiser and stronger and better than all the local guys. And so they start rising higher and higher almost immediately within the levels of the court of the king. So within Daniel, we get some history about that, about life in captivity, about some of the things that happen, about some of the sequences. We get some of the wonderful stories that happen about how the Lord cared for his people even within captivity. That even when it seems like, all hope is lost, all hope was not lost, and you have still been spared. And you have been spared for a purpose and for a reason, and God is faithful to you. You could take this captivity and think, well, that's it. It's over. That's the end of the book. It was a good run while it lasted, but God must hate us now. And so he's washed his hands, we're up a creek, and it's all done. But Daniel, again, giving the words of the Lord to the people within captivity, is story after story reminding them that God is not only present, but God is powerful. Though they have been carted away to a foreign nation that worships foreign gods, do not be deceived. There is only one God Almighty, and he is caring for you even now. So when we get stories like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, when we get stories like Daniel in the lion's den, these are basically little vignettes of people who had every right to think, well, it's over with. I'm somebody's prisoner. They beat me. Their God must be bigger or better or whatever. And so I'm done. Do whatever you want. And yet, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Belteshazzar, Daniel, they stick to it. They remain faithful, and the Lord continues to bless them. And both those circumstances of the fiery furnace and the lion's den are opportunities for the jealous people within the king's court to try to eliminate them and get rid of them. And they both have to do with worship. And both of them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel, prior to the lion's den, both refuse to bow down and to worship, to pray to anyone but God alone, even were they to suffer the consequences. And in both times, they are spared from those consequences in a spectacular fashion. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into a fiery furnace, and yet a fourth figure appears with them within the fire, and they remain unharmed. God is faithful, and he remembers them. They were willing to pay the price, and yet he saves them. And Daniel is thrown into the den of hungry lions and sealed up. And yet even then he is safe. And he is spared. And he is cared for. And God's faithfulness and God's power is proven to all of those pagans who witness. And even in captivity, the people of Israel wind up turning even their captors towards the one true God. Why me? Why did this have to happen to me? Why am I in this jam? Why is it so miserable? Why can't I ever catch a break? Kind of like Esther, maybe there's a reason you are in the position that you are in. the circumstances are what they are, difficult or not. And imagine what might happen if you were to stand firm in these times, and how that might make an impression on those fools. So, Daniel's also filled with a remarkable amount of prophetic prophecy. Some of Daniel's prophecy is apocalyptic, speaking about that day of the Lord, one like the Son of Man. There's some messianic prophecy in there that's basically end times, return of Christ messianic prophecy. But when I say prophetic prophecy, when we talked before about defining prophecy as speaking God's word to his people, but I said that there are times where some of that is like describing future events. There's plenty of that in Daniel. There are, portions where Daniel describes geopolitical events before they happen, some of whom are fulfilled within the succeeding chapters, like his prophecy about the fate of Nebuchadnezzar himself. Some of whom are displayed throughout history, happening hundreds of years after Daniel is dead, and only in our own contemporary studies have we been able to see how the puzzle pieces have fit together within the history of the ancient world and some of the prophecies that Daniel himself has made. It is a long and it is a complicated book. It's such a broad book that goes from stories that are great to tell to kids of courage and faithfulness to some really kind of outlandish and describing events that are happening within the life and the times of Daniel, and things that will happen throughout that region of the world within the centuries still to come. Almost a unique book. So perhaps in that regard, that's why it stands alone within the stuff and things category. It's not really like Isaiah in that sense. Even though Isaiah has this very long lifespan of being the Lord's prophet, we don't see all, because Daniel's here, he's here, and all sorts of little things happening. Same thing with Jeremiah. Ezekiel almost approaches it because Ezekiel does talk about some events and there's some stories in there. But Daniel is just sort of a fascinating standalone book. You want some interesting Bible stories? Look at Daniel. You want some prophecy that will blow your mind? Look at Daniel. All right. Now we're getting to our final section, where we are going to speak about the last few books that are typically grouped together as the books of wisdom, or more specifically books of poetry or truth. Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. These are all grouped together for the most part because they cover the similar sort of ground. All but Job are kind of all in the family. Job is almost a standalone story here, and I will deal with that right now very briefly. Part of the reason that Job throws people off is that it is completely out of chronological order. Job is a reflection deeply backward. The setting contextually of Job is basically is the time of the patriarchs. Job, within the early church, was considered a patriarch. So we're talking like Abraham kind of contemporary. That's sort of the timeline positioning of Job. And Job is a very well-to-do, very successful, and very holy man. And when you read the book of Job, you will be confronted with a theological concept referred to in the shorthand as theodicy. And theodicy, quite simply put, is why do bad things happen to good people? And the field of theology and philosophy, for that matter, have wrestled with this issue from time immemorial. It's a question that pretty much everyone has asked at some point or another. And Job does not intend to give a comprehensive answer, but in a sense it does give a definitive answer. It's just not the answer you might think. Job, again, a well-to-do man who is a holy man, he's called blameless within the sight of the Lord. And you see this kind of weird It's almost like a play where there are various characters, and that's how it's almost structured. And within the play, you see this interaction in kind of a heavenly court between God and between Satan. Now, Ha-Satan in the Hebrew, which is where we get the anglicized Satan, really means, specifically translated, something along the lines of the accuser. The adversary, it's occasionally rendered, for the sake of counsel in the back, we might refer to him as the prosecuting attorney. He's the Warren Burger of our Perry Mason court. That Ha-Satan, Satan, has a job to do. It's a job that we don't like and nobody wants, and he seems nefariously suited to do, but it's his job to kind of poke and prod and yank and pull and wreck stuff. And so Satan, the accuser, is saying, yeah, it's all well and good that Job loves you, God. He loves you because you've given him good stuff. Who wouldn't love you? He's got everything he wants. But you know what? If he didn't have all that junk, he would just curse you up and down, because that's the way these people work. I've been around them. You take away their stuff, and they all whine like babies. Trust me. And so God says, let's try. Go ahead. Do your worst. Anything you want, but just don't kill it. And I will show you what my servant Job is made of. And so that is the book of Job, where Job is these afflictions just overwhelm him. The death of his children, the destruction of his crops, the loss of his wealth, the sores that cover his body and leave him in constant agony. Everything of human comfort has been pulled from him. His own wife, her best advice is, curse God and die. Thank you, dear. That's the best he gets. And yet, Job remains steadfast. Now, Job is perplexed. I don't know why this is happening to me. I haven't done anything wrong. But he refuses to curse God. And the rest of Job is basically a dialogue between Job and these three friends of his. And these guys come and they try to give Job comfort. I mean, they like Job, and Job is suffering. And yet, their advice, as well-intentioned as it is not unlike the sort of advice where, after a tragic death, someone pats the bereaved on the back and says something like, God needed another flower in his garden. I mean, it's well-intentioned in the sense of trying to take something sad and to show how there may be a positive component to it, and yet it trivializes and completely denigrates the reality of that suffering and that loss and that tragedy. But what these friends do, and they first start off trying to say, there, Job, hang in there, buddy. But Job kind of won't play along. They think that if they give Job enough support and comfort, he will finally fess up and come clean and confess this terrible sin that he has committed in order to deserve these bad things. And so they, it's okay, buddy, and hang in there. And Job is just kind of like, okay, thanks, I'm trying. And they keep patting him on the, and then finally they sort of lose their patience, and they're kind of like, what? Will you just stop it? Bad things happen to bad people. You are suffering. Look at what's happened to you. And, the first few times I read Job, I sort of identified with the friends. Because, Job, look at this. This is not normal. You have lost everybody has bad days. This is not this has got to be divine retribution. You have lost your family. You have lost your stuff. You have lost your health. You have lost everything within a day. The lightning has struck you, Job. Think about it. And yet, Job persists. I have not done a thing. He still refuses to curse God, but he is still completely confused. And yet the friends press him again and again and again. In the book of Job is this dialogue. A couple of chapters at a time, the friends, one will make a go at Job and try to convince him. Can't you see why you've done wrong? And it didn't work. And so 2 more chapters come. This time the other friends, they tag up. The other friends start to take a Job. And it never works. And finally, there's this last guy, the young kid, who comes in. And then he just goes way off the rails. And it's almost with being pushed over the edge by the ridiculous assertion of the youngest one. And he's identified as being the youngest one to sort of underscore the fact that at least these first friends, these 3, were kind of elders and they were experienced. But now even the know-nothing kids are getting involved and taking strikes at Job. And then Job has finally had enough. And he starts calling down God. What in the world have I done? Give me a break here. This is ridiculous. How dare you? All I've done is kind of stand here and support you. I've got your back, and you keep doing all this crap to me. Come on now. Why won't you answer me? And then God answers him. And that's how Job concludes. Is that Job gets the answer to the question he was not asking, and he realized he can't ask. The question of theodicy, why do bad things happen to good people? When I say it's answered not comprehensively but definitively within Job, the answer God gives to Job isn't quite so much, well, this is why. This is often disturbing to people who read Job for the first time. The answer God gives is, who do you think you are? I mean, I love you and all, but seriously. Creator of heaven and earth. All this stuff. And then there's you. And you presume to call me to the carpet all up. You think life is unfair? Where were you? Where were you when there was nothing? There was nothingness, and only I existed. And I brought light and life, strung the stars overhead. Have you measured the depths of the ocean? Have you figured out how to keep this globe spinning? Man, there are animals that are bigger than you, who would swallow you without thinking twice. Not only am I not afraid of them, I make them. I can unmake them. I control them. Like the storm, like the earthquake, even like your suffering. Think very carefully. Think very carefully. O dust of the earth. Who you are asking, and what it is that you ask. And Job relents. It's too wonderful for me to forgive you. In the grand scheme of things, what is his suffering? In the grand scheme of things, who is he to question an almighty God and demand answers that satisfy him? It's not so much that God is unwilling to give answers. How could Job possibly understand them? As hard as I might, what am I able to explain in depth to my 2-year-old daughter? It's not that I don't want to. It's not that I'm trying to keep things from her because I'm so much bigger and more important than she is. What could she possibly fathom about what I deal with on a day-to-day basis? She has no concept. Job relents, and yet still has not cursed God. He's been angry. Like Israel, like Jacob, he's wrestled. But faced with his folly, Job relents. And in the end, God has the harshest words, not for Job, in asking his question. Even though God's words are difficult, they're not really angry. Any anger that God has is reserved for the three friends. They get theirs next. God speaks individually to the three friends who have given the bad advice. And they pay for it. And it is the prayers of Job which will free them in the end. The book concludes with Job's fortunes restored. He has twice of every livestock and land, and the 10 children he lost, he has 10 more. And his life has many, many more years and decades of prosperity and peace yet to come. It's not a comprehensive answer, but it is definitive to why bad things happen to good people. And it's the answer of, who are you asking? And what are you really wanting to know? Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes are grouped together. I call them all the family. Psalms, primarily written by King David. Proverbs, a Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes, primarily written by Solomon, his son. Now we spoke of some length about the concept of poetry. I'm not going to dwell on the Psalms because of our time. But what I am going to say is, within the Psalms, which frankly are an excellent place if you're starting to read the Bible or you're encouraging somebody to read the Bible, the Psalms are a wonderful place to start. You can start picking up the rhythm and the cadence. You can start singing about the graciousness and the power of God, and it gives you some good meaty stuff you can dig into with almost no other context. Why? Because the context of the Psalms is the context of life. David, who is himself a poet, and he's a king, and he's a shepherd, and he's a warrior, and he's all these things, is fundamentally a man. He's a flawed man, he's a screwed up man who does really awful things, and yet he's a man that God describes as being after God's own heart. And in his writings in the Psalms, which have been used from time immemorial as worship within the church, are an expression of that relationship and that devotion to God across the entire gamut of human emotion, of human experience. There are psalms that recount the highest of highs and joys and praise, and there are psalms that recount the lowest of lows in grief and in loneliness. There are psalms that are filled with an anger and a rage that seems like it's going to boil over. And there are psalms that are filled with this peace and tranquility. And some are sad, and some are happy, and some are strong, and some are anxious. And some cover everything you could possibly think of within your own life. The context of the Psalms is the context of our lives, and all of the gamut of our experiences, and all of the gamut of our emotions, of our passions, of our dreams, of our fears. Certain psalms by number may be referred to when times are tough or when things are scary. Certain psalms may be read in times of grief or bereavement. Certain psalms are particularly good when you just have praise that wants to bubble out from you. You're so grateful, you're so glad, or your prayer's been so clearly answered. And some psalms are there to speak a loneliness that you don't know how to give words to. Talking about, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It's a song. My God, why have you forsaken me? It's a song. He reached down from on high and took hold of me. He drew me out of deep waters. A song. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon, the stars that you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him? That's a song. God is a righteous judge who expresses wrath and a song. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Song. Father to the fatherless, defender of the widows. Song. God will redeem my life from the grave. He will surely take me to himself. A song. The gamut of human emotions, experiences, passions, fears, desires, Proverbs written by Solomon kind of gets folded into this whole wisdom of Solomon stuff because they're basically wise sayings. A proverb is a wise saying, and for the most part, the Proverbs stand individually alone. Within a chapter, every verse almost stands alone as a discrete piece of advice. They often don't have anything to do with the Proverbs that happened before or happened after. Now, the first couple of chapters set out to develop this concept of wisdom. That wisdom itself is a good and godly thing to be pursued and that you will benefit by. But after that's been established, then it's just sort of like, it's just a chain of good advice. And these are godly principles. These are ones born of experience. These are things, precepts to follow that are prudent, that are powerful, and that will bless us if we listen to their godly and experienced wisdom. Song of Songs. If Proverbs is Solomon kind of at his experienced, wise best, then Song of Songs is the hottest of his passionate youth. Song of Songs it's a love poem. And it's hot stuff. It's so hot and it's so racy, as a matter of fact, that you had to be of certain age before the rabbis would even let you look at it. It was considered just a little too mature for those who weren't experienced enough to handle its provocative nature. Now, it is sort of funny to look back and to see what passes for a smooth pickup line back in the day. The one about how your teeth are so beautiful because everyone has its twin and there are no holes and no gaps. I mean, I guess that was real smooth. Some of it kind of comes across as a little funny, and yet not untrue, even today. Not untrue between the passionate love of a man and a woman who are so overcome with each other. And that passion just sort of pours forth from even the descriptions. Your breasts are like beautiful clumps of dates. And I will climb that tree, and I will pluck those dates. Hot stuff. It has been over the millennia interpreted as Christ's love for his bride, the church, or there are all sorts of ways to see this. But at the end of the day, I think it is worth noting that within Scripture, this is the story of our lives with God and what He intends for us to know, and the love for husband and wife, passionate and erotic and hot and full of deep desire, is in itself a good and gracious gift. And that the Lord has not only given us the ability to feel these passions, but has affirmed it as part of His plan. And finally, Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, which is an interesting book for us to finish on, for there is a time for every season, including a time to finish this class. Most of our experience with the book of Ecclesiastes comes from that song by the Byrds, Turn, 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 which they really do quote from Ecclesiastes, that long passage, which is why you were wondering why a vaguely anti-war folk song talked about gathering stones or not. Well, it's because they're quoting from Ecclesiastes. And within Ecclesiastes, that little phrase is talking about kind of the range of human experiences. There's a time for all these things to happen, for good things, for bad things, for sad things, for happy things, for productive things, for unproductive things, for construction and destruction. There's a time for all of this within the Lord's vast plan. Ecclesiastes, in the Hebrew, referred to as Kohelet, which would be translated as, sometimes it's translated as teacher, probably a little more precise would be preacher. but he's kind of a weird preacher. Ecclesiastes is basically, this would go perfectly well within a class on existentialist philosophy. Ecclesiastes would get an A+ from his professor because these are existential questions about what is the meaning of life. Ecclesiastes is Solomon looking back at the gamut of experiences, and at the end of the day, this is what I've learned. And a lot of it is actually pretty sad, because if you will get this concept of vanity, all is vanity, or all is useless, or all is nothing or worthless. And he'll talk about all the things that he did, and being a smart guy and being a rich guy, he's done it all. So he's saying, wine, woman, and song, been there, done that. Building things, making monuments, been there, done that. Teaching things or learning things, been there, done that. Just fooling around, been there, done that. I was going to sample everything in life that I possibly could. And as a smart guy and a rich guy, that basically meant everything. And at the end of the day, I have learned that it's all basically empty. It's all basically empty. Whoa. Hey. How does that fit in the Bible? And initially, it's going to sound rather disturbing. He's going to say some stuff that sounds bad, some stuff that sounds good, and he's going to come to the conclusion of this, that at the end of the day, it all just doesn't mean anything. And he sounds like your run-of-the-mill atheist. He sounds like an angry agnostic who's saying, well, why even bother? And yet, by reading a little more carefully and following to the end, I think what you see from Kohelet, the preacher, not so much that there is no meaning in anything that we do, but all of that meaning is subordinate to the meaning that we find fully and solely within the Lord our God. To follow God and His law. That's the final conclusion of Kohelet, the preacher. That's where we find meaning, that's where we find purpose, and that is what we ought to do. These other things in life, however vigorously you pursue them, will eventually lead you to a dead end. And as you come back around to it, he's not that far from what you might hear from a good preacher. That if you set your heart on anything other than that which it was created to love, worship, adore, and follow, then that thing will ultimately fail you, disappoint you, let you down, and break your heart. Our hearts were made for God, like our lives, our souls, and our spirits. Our heart is restless until it finds its rest in Thee. A God-shaped hole that can be filled only with Him. And anything else that we try to put in there will be too small, will not be significant enough, and will eventually let us down. Wine, women, and song, try it. Building things and monuments, go for it. Learning and studying, giving it all away or earning it all back. Do what you want. But at the end of the day, these things will leave you empty. They will leave you dry. They will let you down. And they will break your heart. For the greatest measure of man, at our highest, at our peak, at our apex, at our most astounding of accomplishments, still pales in comparison to the might and the power of God Himself. What ought we to do then, other than know His law, follow His law, and love His law? Our restless hearts may wander to and fro, but at the end of the day, they will find meaning, true purpose, and final rest in only one place. And this comes from someone who's done it all, tried it all, and has the t-shirt to prove it. And it is Solomon's final gift of wisdom to say, we will find our rest in God himself. The Old Testament is not quite so old when you see it in those terms, because it's pretty much my life, and I'm pretty sure it's yours too. Whether it's the Psalms that run the gamut of emotions and passions, whether it's the existential wisdom of Ecclesiastes, whether it's the good advice of Proverbs that we try to pass along to our own children and our grandchildren, whether it is the faithfulness of God within the Torah or within the diaspora, within the captivity, in drawing his people back, in making a promise that he will fulfill one day in Christ. The Old Testament really isn't that old at all. The Old Testament ought to be our testament, for it was most certainly Christ's testament. Though it may seem dusty and forgotten, obscure, or difficult, sometimes all we need is the picture on a Lego box to see how all of those bricks are supposed to fit together, and realize, once again, rediscover, if you will, that what we find in the Old Testament is the character of God himself, and what we find in the Old Testament is the truth of our lives as well. Thanks.
Thank you.